My name is James Robson, and I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center. I'd like to welcome you to the Asia Center's Research Talk series, which is part of a new series of virtual programming at the Asia Center. The research talks are aimed at showcasing some of the fascinating research that's being done on various facets of Asia by Harvard students, graduate students, faculty, Asia Center affiliates, and other specialists. We very much hope you enjoyed learning from these talks.
Hi, my name is Subodhana Vijayaratne, and I'm a recent graduate of Harvard's History Department. I specialize in the history of technology in East Asia, and my dissertation charted the emergence and development of Japan's rocketry and space research industries from the 1920s to 2003. Today I'd like to talk about one aspect of my research that I thought was particularly interesting, which was the reaction in localities to the construction of space facilities near where they lived. Japan's burgeoning space program initiated a fresh wave of construction when it began expanding in the late 1950s. Facilities like Tanegashima and Uchinora Space Center were part of a dramatic rebuilding process that unfolded across the whole of Japan in the aftermath of the Second World War. These provide a clear example of Bruno Latour's notion of literal constructivism. Latour points out that for many states, good governance was a notion fundamentally associated with materiality. For Japan in the post-war, no less than for any other state, development envisioned a state thick with things, large cultivated fields, ships, cities, and an immensely developed technology of gathering, meeting, cohabiting, enlarging, reducing, and focusing. In Japan's case, this vision was largely abetted and bolstered by private corporations, which presented ideas for facilities in various locations. Furthermore, many localities saw the benefits of attracting large-scale industrial facilities, whatever industry they may be associated with. This was particularly the case in far-flung areas. In 1985, for example, 18 pro-nuclear groups petitioned authorities in Kaminoseki, Yamaguchi, to allow the construction of a nuclear plant in their village. For areas like this, in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, had witnessed demographic and economic decline. The arrival of large industrial facilities was seen as a way to reclaim the bright life, as they called it. Yet when space programs moved south, they also encountered something called the fishing problem. Space agencies were painfully aware that Japan's fishing unions were robust and combative bodies with a long history of successfully slowing or preventing the construction of major facilities. These included Chubu and Kansai airports in the 1970s and 1980s. Hence, it came as no surprise that fishermen working near both Tanegashima and Uchinora worked to resist the expansion of facilities for the fear of the impact it would have on their livelihoods. In Uchinora, from the onset, local support was crucial for the development of the space facility. As one observer put it, if it weren't for the cooperation of local people, space research wouldn't advance at all. The local Ladies' Association, for example, headed by the indomitable Tanaka Kimi, made up for a large shortage of labor by helping clear debris in order for roads to be constructed. This was despite the dangers. In July and August of 1962, for example, part of the newly built facility was washed down a hillside by torrential rain. The women also helped scientists and engineers find lodgings, sold them bentos, and established shops in the vicinity of the new launch center to help them with their daily needs. In 1962, locals in Uchinora banded together to form the Uchinora Space Observation Cooperation Society to coordinate activities and development with the facility. And for many of them, the arrival of the site was a reprieve from a gradually declining economy. Fishermen had been worried about the precipitous decline in amberjack catches in Uchinora over the previous generation, a trend which, given that amberjack was the area's main product, led to anxieties over livelihood. The arrival of the Space Center, however, brought an influx of customers to the village around the launch center. In the lead up to a test, specialists, students, machine preparators, journalists, and tourists flooded the local shops and bars and booked out all the local inns. On the day of the launch itself, large numbers of people picnicked in nearby areas to watch the action. launches of significant devices such as the Lambda 4S could attract up to 3,600 viewers. Events abroad could also have an effect on tourist numbers, which increased, for example, after the launch of Apollo. Tourists came from as far away as southern Honshu. On at least one occasion, a group of students from a sister school made their way all the way from Hokkaido, over 3,000 kilometers away. Officials were keen to point out that development at Uchinura would have a positive impact on the sales of locally caught fish, as customers increased the influx of workers and tourists. Indeed, the village's economy became so reliant on the space facility that long gaps in launches could have a negative impact on the local economy. The arrival of large numbers of tourists had a broader infrastructural impact on the village as well. For January-February 1969 launch window, for example, authorities had to prepare parking and viewing locations for spectators, a project which took the combined efforts of half of the local council, a grand total of 15 people. Even the police chipped in on occasion by providing guidance and escorts to convoys of rocket pods heading to the Space Center. Locals also collaborated with the Space Center to petition for investment in roads, improvements which both groups benefited from. It was with the help from citizens of Uchinura village that ISAS convinced the prefecture to construct a new 735-meter access road to the facility. Other roads were widened and made more accessible. Bus journeys that previously took 2.5 hours were now halved in duration. By 1968, a paved rocket road wound its way up the coast, providing not only better access to the facility, but speedier transport for locals. The arrival of the rocket center also captured the imagination of citizens. Many took great pride in the area's contribution to what were presented as developments of global significance. As various Lambda launches in 1969 drew Japan closer to putting its own satellite in orbit, for example, locals dubbed their village Global Uchinura. One group who were particularly engaged were local children. Primary school 5th grader Kanadomi Mikiko, for example, wanted to be a stewardess, though by the time she was old enough to become one, she speculated, people would travel not in planes, but in rockets. Schools across the area embraced the identity of Kagoshima as the rocket prefecture, which was indeed the theme of a 1966 prefecture-wide school sports day. They would even on occasion give students breaks from classes to allow them to attend particularly significant rocket launches. The village of Uchinura-cho proudly embraced the moniker of Rocket Village, and companies even cashed in by naming their products after rockets, such as the Rocket Automatic Long Life Burner, which could be used to grill food and was released in 1969. Despite this, however, the space program's arrival did meet with some intense disapproval. One group who were particularly concerned were the 22 households living in Nagatsubo, close to the facility. They made repeated requests to Tokyo University to expand the road leading to and from their houses, which was in effect their only route of egress, a request which was granted in 1966. It's also important to note that the actual economic benefits of the arrival of the Space Center for Uchinura-cho was not as dramatic as hoped. One indicator of this is the fact that the village's registered population actually declined from the time the Space Center was built. It peaked at 11,792 in 1955, and by 1970 had declined to 8,328. Currently, a mere 3,827 people live in Uchinura-cho. Therefore, it may well have been the case that whatever economic benefits the Space Center brought were relatively short-lived, and served only to halt, rather than stop, the decline of the village. The most intense resistance, however, came from fishermen. The local fishermen's union contained some 240 members. Many complained that they were worried that debris falling from the rocket launches would affect their already fragile fishing grounds. In 1966 and 1967, protests about the disruption to local fishing resulted in a delay to the planned launch of Lambda S3 rockets, which effectively delayed Japan's race to launch their own satellite. Authorities offered them compensation to the tune of 100 million, but the fishermen stepped up their campaign, primarily using the tactic of sailing into exclusion zones at times when rocket launches were planned. A committee established to find out what had gone wrong was told that the union had received somewhat less than the original grant. Even though they attempted to create a new compromise, fishermen shut down activities at Uchinura entirely for the better part of 3 years. Their activities were supported by the larger, more powerful Miyazaki Fishermen's Union, who, as we will see below, made their presence felt even more fiercely in Tanegashima, which was further south. Indeed, the Miyazaki Union's leader, Fukuda Kazure, became the political voice of the anti-space center movement, arguing that the issue was not a matter of mere reparations, but of protecting their way of life. Some within the Miyazaki Union disagreed, but their own fishermen joined the protests. In 1968, for example, the South Miyazaki Fishermen's Union halted a series of launches of rockets from Uchinura by again sailing into the exclusion zone. The actions of the Fishermen's Union here reflect similar activities by sister groups resisting large-scale industrial facilities across the country, from airports in Kansai to nuclear power stations. These protests, of course, had a profound impact on villages such as Uchinura-cho. In the absence of rocket launches, many tourist-reliant businesses went bankrupt, and villages lent their support to personnel working at the sites despite the fishermen's objections. Against a backdrop of heightened tensions in 1968, the mayors of both Uchinura-cho and Minamitane-cho gave a joint interview to the press emphasizing the importance of rocket facilities to their local economies. Negotiations between the Fishermen's Union escalated to involve Kanemaru Saburo, the governor of the prefecture, who in 1968 used his political links to pressure unions into accepting a lavish resolution offered by the national government. This included subsidies for expanding fishing infrastructure, help finding new fishing sites, and a limitation to launches to no more than 90 days a year. By late 1969, sentiment had begun to change amongst fishermen. They argued now that they had nothing against activities at Uchinura. They simply wanted guarantees on their livelihood. In fact, they actively supported the activities and wanted them to succeed. After all, if they were denied a day of fishing and the rocket launch that they were denied for the sake of failed, it was embarrassing before the rest of the world, as one fisherman commented. The end result was that a combination of prefecture-level and local pressures saw a settlement emerge in the 1970s, whereby launches were limited to 2 narrow windows a year. Following this, resistance largely dissipated. In fact, the relationship between local fishermen and the Space Center morphed into one of occasional cooperation. Support of local fishermen remains a crucial element in Uchinura's successful functioning even today. The launch of the Halley fleet in 1985, for example, which was a flotilla of probes sent to intercept Halley's comet, required delicate negotiations with fishermen. The story of Japan's space facilities in the 1950s to 1980s, therefore, is largely a story of how initial resistance melted into gradual acceptance. The building of places such as Tanegashima Space Center can be therefore placed in the context of broader societal responses to the building of so-called social bads in post-war Japan, locations such as incinerators, nuclear power stations, and airports. As with the siting of those facilities, responses could be aggressive and dangerous, as when Tanegashima's fishermen sailed downrange of rocket launches. They could also cause a great deal of inner turmoil, causing rifts between local authorities, trade unions, corporations, and the state. In the end, however, Japan's space facilities differed in one crucial aspect from the experience of other social bads. By the 1980s, resistance had faded away. Buoyed by the end of large-scale launch center construction, the efforts of various state and local institutions, and nationalism, these areas were no longer considered social bads. Even though they did not live up to their economic potential, they became loci of heritage and identity. In this mode, they've now become sources of not just space research, but bottle rocket festivals, art, humanitarian efforts, and other socially significant activities. Outcomes which surely none of the original builders could have foreseen. So thank you very much for listening. I apologize if you hear some snoring in the back. That's my dog. He's a pug, and he finds rocket launches extremely boring. If you have any questions, you can get in touch with me through my website, which is subovijayaratne.com. That's SUBOWIJEYERATNE.com. I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.